Welcome everybody. I'm Tom Blanton and I'm definitely out of uniform. Did not bring my white sneakers. I wore my tie instead of the white Prados t-shirt. But partly it's to say that John Prados was as at home, as comfortable, down here in the Churchill Center, debating how Winston Churchill used signals intelligence, and wearing a coat and tie, as he was upstairs in the archive conference room down in a Puerto Rican rum or two. And so I just want to welcome you now to the Gelman Library, home of the Churchill Center and the National Security Archive. And it was really John's home away from home for these past 25 years, and we're really proud of that. The one time that I was ever in this space with John, this is what he did. He patted Winston Churchill on the head in a kind of a proprietary motion almost, because he knew as much about what Churchill did because of the very first thing John Prados ever published, which is the award-winning board game, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which was published in 1974, partly the inspiration from Lenny, who's here today to say a few words. And I thank Danny for bringing this historic copy, which I'll have to return, but I want to just display it because there's a certain poetry here. Before John ever wrote one of his great books, he was already gaming out the what ifs if that guy hadn't become prime minister or hadn't made certain decisions or used intelligence in certain ways. And so that kind of poetic justice, I think, speaks to where we are, and sense of place is vital. We're going to combine these two, a kind of Churchill Center substance and remarks from people who knew John and loved John. And then I want to invite all of you guys upstairs to the archive conference room where John was life of the happy hour so many times. And you know what I'm talking about. Let me just start with a few thank yous. And first to really John's family, and especially to Ellen, and also beloved daughters, Danny and Tasha, and who've been talking to me about this, and brother Joey and Mary, and just amazing people, one and all. You'll see in the program, each one of them will have some remarks about John. Will take us back to childhood and forward to today and missing him. I gotta say a big thanks to Malcolm Byrne and Renat Bikiniya, who's in the back. Renat is filming this to put on our YouTube channel, just so you're aware, later for folks who couldn't come. A lot of people couldn't come because of COVID or travel or whatever. And Malcolm is the one who both organized the Diplomatic Historians Forum to do this huge takeout on John's incredible scholarship. And if you look in your program today, down the lower left corner, there's a URL. You can go on the web and see not just that whole scholarly forum, but the great essay that Malcolm Byrne wrote about John, the essay I wrote about John on the Archives website, an essay John wrote about himself called Panning for Gold, to try to explain his scholarly career. That's where I got the quote where I called John the ultimate prospector in the documentary Gold Rush. And that was John. So also in there is a wonderful note Ellen did for the Vietnam Veterans Against the War publication, and both of the obituaries in the New York Times and Washington Post. So I just encourage you to go there. We couldn't print enough of those pages to give out to everybody, but it's on the web, and it's on the web forever in our view. So our thank yous to Malcolm especially for organizing all. He couldn't be here today because he was sick, so let's all be careful out there. And to Renat for all the IT spectaculars. One of the things that we're going to have are some videos from key folks, childhood friends, scholarly colleagues who couldn't be with us today. And so we have Renat and Malcolm to thanks for that. And I want to say a huge thank you to the archive folks who really made this happen. So Sue Bechtel, who really ran arrangements and Evites, and Lisa and Autumn and Rachel and Mike and everybody who came to help set up with chairs or set up the table, probably most important upstairs. Just a huge shout out to all of them, to Svetlana, who brought the incredible flowers that you will see here and also upstairs. So I want to just come back to that phrase, panning for gold, because that was the last thing, that theme, the last thing John said to me just a couple of weeks before he died. The archive was creating a project to excavate more of the presidential libraries, where so many of these classified documents are still sitting unseen, tucked away in the vaults. And John laughed. He urged us, go for it, go for it, go for it, Tom. And he said this, he said, "There's gold in them thar hills." And you can just hear John laughing when he said that. That was his core thought. Our friend Jim Hirschberg found a review from 1982 of John's first book, The Soviet Estimate. And it was a review written by Thomas Powers in the Atlantic magazine. And it was a review that just was in awe of what John had accomplished. In 1982, there was no Google, there was no internet. What John had at the Columbia University libraries was this enormous stack of newly declassified CIA assessments of the Soviet Union, and an equally large and less informed stack of published articles and op-eds and journal debates about the Soviet intentions. And John created a dissertation in that first book out of that incredible material, and Thomas Powers wrote this in his review: "How Prados survived his ordeal in the library, I do not know. It must have involved years of stupefying tedium, but the result has justified his devoted efforts. Well-thumbed copies of that book, The Soviet Estimate, will be at the right hand of everyone who tries to understand why the United States and the Soviet Union elected to build enough nuclear weapons to break the back of our civilization." Unquote. That goes to the heart of John Prados' mission on this earth. I'm paraphrasing him when he talked about his motivations. He said, setting out on books, he was looking for questions that needed answers. Why the nuclear arms race? Why the Vietnam War? Etc. He was looking for questions that needed answers. And second, he was looking for records that needed opening. And I'd throw a third one in there. He didn't say this, but I will. He was also looking for history and policy decisions that needed moral judgment to hold a powerful toolkit. So I think it was Robert McMahon, the great diplomatic historian, in one of his essays on John's work, he said, you know, the great thing about John Prados is he always looked and talked as if he had just come from an anti-war demonstration. From personal experience, I can tell you he had just come. There was a demo. Yep, John was there. My own favorite metaphor, before I turn things over to folks who've known John even longer than I have, my own favorite metaphor for what John succeeded in doing is the one about him illuminating the dark matter in the universe. You know, in physics, this is the stuff that actually might make up a majority of the universe. We just don't know, and we can't actually see it. It has no luminosity. But we can see the effect that dark matter has by gravitational impact on lots of other objects we can't observe. And I think what John excelled at was going after the dark matter of the classified universe that we couldn't see, that was in the vaults, but we could observe its gravitational effects. And digging that out, because if he could reveal that dark matter, it could radically change our understanding of our own history and our own present. John Prados. There's so much else to be said, Much of it will be said right here and later upstairs over drinks. But let me just finish my little 5 minutes with a note that Sue and I got from Cy Hirsch earlier this week, apologizing that he couldn't be here. And the note began, classic Cy, onward, with 3 or 4 G's, Sue and Tom. Glad to get you a reminder of the event for the unstoppable John, who rolled out one remarkable book after book. But I'm on a 6 a.m. flight Friday. I can't be avoided. Please know that I consider John's scholarship to be just that, scholarship. The rest of us are spokesmen for the ephemeral. Spokesmen for the ephemeral. His generosity, like that of all at the National Security Archive, was very gratifying, much needed, and much appreciated. Cy Hirsch. John the scholar, John's generosity, John's legacy. They're all here. So let me now move to John's childhood with Joey Mary. Joey, John's brother, proud graduate of the University of Kansas, which Kansas Press published many of John's great books. Now in Austin, Texas, private architect, etc. And then after Joey, I'm going to call up Mary Prados, certified public accountant, Miami, Florida, and a proud graduate of the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico. Joey, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This will pick up just about everything. John was about a year and a half, year and 3/4 younger than me. And so when we got to a certain point where we were not playing in the sand anymore, and we had moved to Laurelton, Queens, and he and I, we started off when he was about 6 and I was about 8, we started doing things. And I think that toys started us off. And John had a collection of toy soldiers. And we had Civil and World War II. And the Civil War, of course, were little gray soldiers and little blue soldiers. And then there were little khaki soldiers for World War II. And not far from us, walking distance was a library. And we discovered books. And John, he brought from the library all these books about battles and war and famous people involved in battles and wars and politics. And I brought home Tom Swift and the Hardy Boys, but John read these books and meticulously played out the battles that were in these books, and we had other toys, like he had electric trains. We both had electric trains, and we had building sets, and which kind of turned me on to be an architect eventually. And John wasn't really that interested in them, and John was interested in model cars, but we were interested in model airplanes. And so, as a result, from my brother, I've learned what a P-51 is, what a B-29 is, what a B-17 was a ME-109 Messerschmitt airplane, Japanese Zero. I basically knew all, and of course Phantoms and today's jets. And so I enjoyed a lot of John's side. And John didn't wasn't crazy from my side, but he did like the electric trains. And so then the other big thing that happened was Dad would take us down to Jamaica. In order to get into New York City and to Manhattan, you had to change from the bus to, we didn't have a car, bus to the subway in Jamaica. Well, this Times Square discount store appeared. We didn't know what a discount store was, but what this store sold were Avalon Hill games. And
the gateway drug.
right. We had been playing Monopoly and other board games, Risk, and we, of course, checkers and chess, and but this was something different. And John bought Tactics 2, and we bought Dispatcher, which is a railroad game also made by Avalon Hill. And so John was fascinated with these games. They were just an amazing thing for him, and how the books connected with the games. So then, when I was 14 and John was about 12, we moved to San Juan, Puerto Rico. No library. And thank God there was a Matias bookstore that was walking distance. And so from then on, what wasn't in our high school library, John had to buy books. And however, by that time, we were getting pieces of cardboard, putting pieces of cardboard together, and drawing grids, and beginning to design games. John was beginning to design games, and I would play with him in these games. And so it was a great thing. And now, it's sad for me, because John was so up on, and one thing I really was so happy when he would come to Austin to research at the LBJ Library. And he would come every couple years, usually, to see the documents that have just been released or declassified from the LBJ Library. And which and they know him there. And now John is gone, and I'd love to call him and tell him different things or ask him about stuff. Examples are, of course, I want to ask him about what's going on with different things with the war we're now involved in over in Ukraine, and also I want to tell him things like I have a recent new friend who bought a P-51 Mustang, wrecked P-51 Mustang, and restored it, and completely to flyable condition, and this fellow sold it for $3 million after he did this work. And I'm sure John would have been really interested in that. And so, anyway, so we were, then we had our younger sister, Mary, and we were, at the time, Joey, Johnny, and Mary. Now, not the same. So, we said Mary and Joey, and we've got Gato and John for my brother. So anyway, now our next speaker is going to be my sister Mary.
So John and I had a complicated relationship, very complicated. Either we got along or we didn't get along. So I want to talk about when he was already in the university. My first T-shirt, which I still have from Columbia, I still have that T-shirt. He gave it to me. That's when we got along. Another time that we got along was we shared interest in recreational drugs. And I remember that he had a bag of marijuana, and we did not have paper to roll it up, so he decided, oh, let's make brownies. And this was like Christmas Eve. Of course, my father was very, very into Christmas. That's why I think John became very interested in Christmas. And so he always brought us, because if we were out of, we were out of Puerto Rico, I was in New Orleans, John was in New York, and Joe was in Kansas, in Lawrence, Kansas. He would bring us to celebrate Christmas. And so that Christmas, he brought us in, and John had the bag, and he said, oh, let's make brownies, let's make brownies. And so everyone ate brownies, my dad ate brownies, my mother ate brownies, and we all had a great time. So that's the time when we got along. Another time when we so got along was a time that he came. He used to come with his girlfriends too, and my dad would pay everyone's ticket for Christmas. He would pay everyone's ticket. And I remember I was in my room, and and Joe and John always shared a room. Joey and John always shared a room since I was born. And I remember I was in the room and I said, I'm smelling terrible. I don't know what's going on. And I took a shower and I loaded John Latte cologne on me and got back to my room and I said, I'm smelling terrible, what's going on? And then I said, I have to go and wash all my clothes. And opened the closet, and there was a jacket that belonged to John. I was not happy. And so I took the jacket and I put it back in their room. I didn't say anything. I put the jacket back in their room. And then suddenly, like that evening, the jacket was back in my room. So there again, I put the jacket in my room, and Joey was the one that was putting the jacket in my room. And so I said, not my room, not my room. And so we put it somewhere else in the house. But anyway, these are two funny stories. But as I said, John and I had a complicated relationship, but I loved him very much. And I admired him. And I'm very proud of him and his legacy. And fortunately and unfortunately, I did not understand all this work that he did until afterwards, after he left. And I feel really sorry that I was not able to say goodbye. That's what I most regret. And but God bless him. He's there with Daddy and Mommy somewhere, doing his research. Maybe he's doing his research on he was an atheist. So maybe he's doing a real research on God and whatever, St. Peter or whatever. Anyway, who knows? But God bless you, John. I love you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. We have video messages from two of John's dear friends from high school in Puerto Rico. And with the magic that Renat has waved his wand over, I'm hoping that this will work.
Thanks to everyone, and especially Ellen, thank you for including me to be part of this special event to celebrate John's life. My name is Sylvia Juves Fernandez, and my husband is Jorge Fernandez. We were both colleagues and friends to John Prados. When I think of John while we were in high school where we met, 3 words come to mind: intelligence, maturity, and leadership. As a 15-year-old person in high school, I often wondered about John in terms that I thought maybe he's actually a very important professor at an Ivy League university who scientifically changed or transfer his mind to a young man's body in high school to do or perform a kind of investigation or research. The level of his discussions, the so-called simple books he read, the conversations with teachers about leadership and other topics, such as science and especially history, were completely beyond our scope as high school folks that would, probably we would engage in other kinds of mundane topics. He could easily give a professional presentation, impromptu actually, on history, especially World War II. If my memory serves me right, I would say that it was during our sophomore year that he told us about his involvement in creating this war game. Well, one day he invited us to come over to his parents' house so that we could test drive that game. And we did. I remember that the floor that were these little tiles, a tile floor. And this game was far from being completed. And so we used the tile floors as the game board. This war game was, he thought it would probably be called the Third Reich. And so at that point, we had no idea of the future outcome of this war game or any success in the future. But one thing we were absolutely convinced by the end of that afternoon, and that was that this was beyond being great. We also realized that we had just experienced the inception of something that was bigger than ourselves at our young age of 15 or 16 years old. Well, as it turns out, many years later, when we found out about the enormous success of this war game, followed by more successful war games, followed by various books he published, we recognized two things. How lucky we were to have been or have had a first-hand experience of the creation of something extraordinary. And also how generous of our friend John to allow us to be part of such experience. I want to thank John for letting us be part of that brilliant beginning. Love to all his family. Love to you, Ellen. Thank you so much. And again, Sylvia Juves and my husband, Jorge Fernandez. Delighted to be part of this wonderful occasion. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dorothy Riera. I was a classmate of John during his years in Puerto Rico, and I am so honored to share my memories with him. I remember John all throughout our high school years. In our yearbook, the quote that was below his name was from a British author, and it read, "The mind is the master of the man, and so they can who think they can." Even as a young student, John was a well-informed senior. He liked to be organized. He was an individualist and never conformed with group mentality. Always you could find John reading what we called simple books. While we were reading A Catcher in the Rye, Wuthering Heights, and Treasure Island, John was reading books from World War II and articles from the newspaper on the Vietnam War. He participated in many school clubs, the chess club, the science club, the domino club, and the National Honor Society. This was the only club that you were elected to by the faculty based on character, service, leadership, and academics. At the induction ceremony, John gave the speech on leadership. He was also assistant to the newspaper. John was very, very intense, and you could always find him in the library in a meditation pose. John was humble, and he never made us feel that he was more intelligent than we were. We were young kids at the time, and we knew he was brilliant, but we did not understand the depth of his brilliance. On the forensics team, he wrote about the Vietnam War and how it affected him. He won first prize. When John went to Colombia, and in the summer he would come to Puerto Rico, he would always get together with the class. He never forgot us. John was driven. John was an exceptional student, a brilliant mind, and a great friend. May he rest in peace.
So Dorothy brought us in John's trajectory to New York City in the late 60s, early 1970s. I want to turn it over to Jim Dingaman, who was there in an office of a simulations, publications.
No, I'll straighten it all out.
He's going to straighten it all out. But this is,
All right,
this
now-
is gaming extraordinaire.
There's other guys out here who are very well aware of this. My name is Jim Dingman, and I've been a friend of John's for 50 years plus. John and I first met in the fall of 1971. And I can see John right here with a big smile on his face, a doobie in his hand, watching us right now. That's the John Prados that I knew and loved. I hope I keep it together. John loved loud, raucous music, lots of fun. I'm going to get into that later because there's parts of John that some of you don't know anything about, and I intend to hip you to it today. John was, he had a friend who loved Frank Sinatra, and if I had to think of any song that Frank Sinatra did that described John, it's My Way. That to me was John. Now, John and I did many things over 50 years. The last time we did something together, I had him come to Columbia Law School and do a presentation. We had a whole conference on the My Lai massacre in 2018. And John came up and participated with me and Jonathan Bush, who was a professor of law there. We had a British barrister. We had her do all the phone calls to Lieutenant Calley and all the other guys. And it was quite an event, and John came up, and that's the last formal time I saw him physically. During the pandemic, again, and I want to thank, of course, his daughters and Ellen for this opportunity to talk. John gave a talk about the Battle of the Philippine Sea, because we did this all the time. John and I did these things for 50 years, and I'll enumerate them. Now, in terms of the war games, look, war games were like pamphlets, they were like books, they were like hyperlinked explorations in history. One has to look at all the work he did, and then look at all those games and put them alongside it. I'm getting a little, I get a little emotional. That is what he did. Also, those games have to be looked on as books. He did the same kind of research that he did for everything else in his life. And I have those two vignettes that are sort of humorous to share about his wargaming stuff. Now, John took me into the basement of the SEPA building at Columbia, where he would do his maps. It's about 1972. And in that room, the place was huge. It was like 3 times or 4 times bigger than this room. It had a light table there. And John would sit there and take the maps and copy them. Well, there was one obstacle there.
There was a woman who ran the place, who was a Holocaust survivor, and she would come in and say, I'm imitating her now, "What are you doing with these maps? You stretch these maps with these tapes and you're copying them? What are you doing? You're ruining the maps." And she would just constantly do this whenever we showed up. And it took about a year to quiet her down. But she would prevent him from actually doing the maps and tracing the maps. Now, another aspect that is not too known with the play testing for the Ride and Paul the Third Reich was John was living on 110th Street. And he was living in a place, he had Lee Eula there as a roommate, Bill Geisler, who was here in the audience, who was a good friend of his. And John had discovered Jamaican Blue Mountain as a luxury coffee item. So John would call me up and say, "Jim, can you come up and play test this game?" "I don't know, man." "Oh, come on. I got Jamaican Blue for you. I have it in the icebox. It's nice and cold." "Okay, maybe I'll come up." And that was me play testing with John. I don't, the war game stuff is a whole separate ball game. Now, one of the things that is unique about John, it's not really recognized, is all the chaos at Columbia University. He basically was able to do 20 to 30 credits of Vietnam War studies as an undergraduate. That gave him the jump on a whole bunch of scholars who never did. I mean, Bill and I were talking about this on the train coming down from New York. Like, how did he get away with it? And he was chased out of the history department at Columbia because the chair of the department said, "What are you doing? You do this one paper on Vietnam, another paper on Vietnam. This is not, I can't recognize this." And they chased him into the IR program at Columbia. Now, the IR program at the time, you also had David Okolko as an adjunct professor during that period of time. Those of you who remember, Okolko had just done his book in '68 on American foreign policy in World War II. So that was someone who impacted on John. When he did Year of the Rat in 1972, what is not known is that that was due to the fact that we had brothers and sisters here from VBAW. There was one of the national, VBAW was nuts at the time. There were guys like planning airborne drops at the Miami Convention. I remember Bill Lemmer, who was the informant in the Gainesville Lake trial, one time coming in, there was like 5 pounds of smoke in there, all sorts of crazy shit going on. And John was asked, along with me, by a national coordinator to come in and basically collate the information we're getting from all the GIs during the Easter Offensive of 1972. In other words, guys were calling up from the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Navy, reporting their movement orders. Like, my squadron's just been alerted from El Toro to fly to Thailand. And this was information coming in, and it was like unprecedented. I mean, they were like basically court-martial offenses. And we were collating all this information and giving it to the media. So that's the basis of Year of the Rat, that first game he does. Now, and not many people know that. Now, another aspect of this is him taking the comps in the doctoral program. John basically said, "I'm going to take the comps, I'm going to take the written comps, and I'm going to answer it as a revisionist historian." And I remember laughing. I said, "They're going to fail you, man." And which he did the first time they did fail him. Because he had certain people, Warner Schilling and other people, Cold War types. And then what occurred was he finally sort of adjusted and sort of figured out how he had to get through this. But I'm saying these things because it's decently the basis for how independent he was. Now, in the mid-70s, Henry Kissinger was offered a permanent professorship at Columbia by David Rockefeller. Now that completely freaked everybody out. There was sort of an ecumenical attack by all these graduate students, Palestinians, Israelis. John persuaded Roger Hilsman to agree to not let Kissinger come. And one of the things we did at the time, myself, Larry Weiss, and John, I was working in an Italian restaurant, I had to come down, I said, "Okay, I want you guys to figure out this class that Larry's going to teach for Senator McGovern on American foreign policy." And so I brought John and Larry together, and we figured out the whole class over basically serving them Italian food that day. And the class was a class that was quite successful. Senator McGovern came, and we made sure we delivered to Henry Kissinger's office here in Washington all the stuff that was going on. So we won that battle. He didn't come. Now, something else that people don't know about is his involvement with the apartheid campaigns that occurred at that period of time. John was asked by the Sean Gervasi, was working at the United Nations, the UN Committee Against Apartheid, and they asked us to do what was essentially an open source intelligence analysis of the South African military and the Rhodesian military, the wars that had occurred in Southern Africa. So we were asked to, because they had nothing like that at the United Nations. And so John participated with that. I know that the National Security Archives had a little, co-joint spat in 2004 with Ken Maxwell. Ken Maxwell actually helped us put that together. And another thing that happened, which was sort of noteworthy, was Richard Pearl. I decided to confront Richard Pearl, the Prince of Darkness, at an event, and I argued with him about the backfire of bomber. Now, John was writing the Soviet estimate at that time, his dissertation, and I had this big confrontation with Richard Pearl where I sort of made an ass out of myself. I sort of like, oh, the backfire of bomber. And so John said, Jim, never do that again. Always, if you're going to confront people in power, have your act together. And I always had followed that lesson to this point in time. As a journalist, I always made sure that if I'm going to sit and fight with somebody, I know what I'm talking about. Now, John was very angry at the late 70s when there were big conferences on the Vietnam War occurring, and people deliberately did not invite him to come. He had a faculty member who he liked, she will remain nameless, she's still active in the field, who basically wouldn't invite him to Washington to a big conference on the Vietnam War, where Harry Summers was there, sort of reconstructing, the sort of bipartisan, middle-of-the-road narrative that existed before the war in Vietnam. And John was very angry about that and felt like, I'm going to show him. So that was his attitude. That's when he was doing Operation Vulture. Now, the first time John ever got on TV, the two of us decided we were very upset about the hostage crisis. So we decided to organize a press conference and bring in the media to Colombia and talk about how ridiculous it would be for the United States to invade Iran and then launch a commando raid. And so we had the NBC, ABC, CBS with maps of Tehran showing them where a possible commando raid would go. And that was the first time John was on television, on national television with me. Now, the final thing I'm going to say is John's sense of fun and how much John liked to party and how he loved to dance. When he was away during Operation Sail, which was this big event in 1976, where they had sailing ships up and down the Hudson, he gave his apartment over to us, and we had this huge party with 200 people at his apartment on Riverside Drive. And that sort of triggered the kind of parties we had afterwards, which John completely participated 100% with. One party we had a friend of ours who had been the Saigon bureau chief for Reader's Digest. And her nickname in Saigon, I don't know if the same were after this, was the Joint Chief of Staff. And I said to her, like, well, how to roll a joint? And she said, yeah, sure. Boom, she rolled 40. And we had this huge party, which triggered all the parties that went on. And so we finally, by the late 70s, we were having parties in Lower Manhattan. John was completely part of this, where we had all the African delegations from the United Nations, all these guys and gals would show up because we were doing these incredible jams. They'd play their music, John would come in, Jim, I want to play this music. So John loved to dance and have a great old time. And I just want to say that, end this with, I can see him right here smiling as we talk about this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jim. And next I want to call on Lenny Glenn, who's, despite a checkered career as a journalist and speechwriter for Dukakis, Clinton, and others, remained friends with John despite that for decades. And so please, Lenny, come up, a historic figure.
Thank you. Boy, a lot of tough acts to follow today. And of course, the biggest, toughest act of all is John himself. And I have a huge hole in my heart. I knew John, I literally can't remember the first time I met him, but I think it must have been at Simulations Publications, which was a military history wargaming magazine published in New York, 23rd and South Park Avenue South. And I got to know John then, and I drew him in and actually encouraged and tried to open the way for him to do his game, Year of the Rat, which I think was his first published game at Simulations. And he and I just hit it off. We stayed friends from 72 through the present. Our common interest was war games and military history. And it's a surprising thing that, people that, the more you know about war, the more you read about military history, the more you loathe war itself. I mean, the more you know about it, the more horrified you are by what it does to human beings and whole countries. So it's a kind of a paradox that if you may find it fascinating, and indeed something like World War II is an incredibly dramatic story, of how it gets out of control and then it swings and it goes and new countries enter and tragedies happen. Very interesting story. But those people who know it and study it, or the Civil War, or any war, come away as John did, deeply hostile to actual war itself. And I think that was a strain throughout his life in his political activity, his opposition, obviously, to nuclear war, or to people like Kissinger, who are actually comfortable with war and believe it a useful element of our national policy. Just a couple personal things. I mean, he and I were just pals. We did overlap. We did 2 or 3 games together where I'd come up with an idea. Usually the division of labor would be, hey, John, why don't we do a game about espionage in Europe in the 1930s? We'll have a map of Europe and we'll have tiles representing certain secrets and agents and counter-agents that move around. And I don't know, let's call it spies. So I'd come up with kind of the germ of an idea, and then John would do weeks or months of research and actually produce the game. So we did that 2 or 3 times. We did a game called Cold War about the twilight struggle between the US and communism. We did a game on spies. And I actually had a hand in promoting him. I was driving a cab at the time as a student at Columbia, and he was a passenger. I guess I'd given him a ride and was stopped in front of a restaurant near Columbia and talking just before he gets out and goes away. I said, John, you could do this, we could do this, I'll help you a little bit. Why don't you do that? So I would always be like holding his coat and putting him in the ring with some gigantic intellectual challenge, which he would take on, and I'd say, it was my idea. But John did actually proceed to do Third Reich. I helped a little, I did. But he did 92% of the work, 95% of the work. It sold about 300,000 copies over the years. And it's a testimony to the wretched, rip-off royalty structure in the war game business. If that was a book, John would have retired comfortably, much more comfortably than he did. They pay practically peanuts. I think he maybe made $40,000 off that. The publishers of that game are still making money off of it. Just a couple of quick images. Whenever the season changes, from spring to fall to somehow John comes into my mind. Because we were walking together one day, late August, early September, that turn season, down one of the streets to Riverside Drive. And it was reasonably warm, but you turn the corner on Riverside Drive, and all of a sudden, amid the wind, there's like razor blades of cold. You feel it, sense it. John says, winter's coming. So he was like weeks ahead of me perceiving it, and so every time I sensed the season change. I'm reminded of my friend. Another image, the ultimate multitasker. This is Prados in his apartment on Riverside Drive. Third or fourth story with a little balcony out front where he had a barbecue. He's got a steak cooking out there. It's like the size of a Volkswagen. His big bottle of wine, he's made some salad, and we're hanging out and talking. He's working on, right in front of him, spread out on the table is, you know, some complex war game, maybe the Battle of Nations, 1813, Napoleon against 3 different countries, and he's got moving pieces and thinking about the rules as he works on it. He's smoking a joint, quite as always. He's got, on his lap, cracked open, he's got General Zhukov's memoirs, which he's also reading while he works on the game, smokes the joint, and Procol Harum is playing at about 5,000 decibels in the apartment. It all comes back, it all comes back. Someday it all comes back to you. And John is paying attention to everything. Zhukov, Procol Harum, the game, me. I mean, the guy was astonishingly able to handle like 5 different levels of reality at once. I miss him. I will miss him the rest of my life. And I know many of you may feel the same way. And the last thought I'd share with you is not so much a memory of him as just a reflection on what we feel. The pain that we feel is the reciprocal of the joy that he gave us. If we had a choice, I could spare this pain, but only at the cost of never having known John Prados. You gotta be kidding. I wouldn't miss that guy for the world. And I don't care if it hurts to lose him. I knew him, I loved him, and he'll be with me in my mind and heart so long as I'm on this planet. Thanks. Thank you. Now I want to call on the videotape to Lloyd Gardner, Dean of Diplomatic History. Thoughts about John?
Good morning. My name is Lloyd Gardner, and I'm so very happy to participate in this salute to one of the great people that I've known, John Prados. And it's particularly fitting that this is being done today because this morning I read the obituary of a man named Ken Potts. He was 102 years old, and he was the oldest person to serve on the USS Arizona when it was sunk on December 7th, 1941. And Mr. Potts, or Seaman Potts, had been ashore at the time of the attack started and went back out to the Arizona, saved some people in the ocean, and went back into the ship and tried to pull out some other people. And he was so typical of the 1930s, born in Honeyville, Illinois, in a house that had no electricity or running water, one-room schoolhouse, joined the CCC, the New Deal thing, and then went into the Navy and served in the Navy there at Pearl Harbor throughout the war. And I thought, who could write this story better than John Prados? Because what John had was a marvelous ability to make the specific and the personal part of the general story of American history, particularly American military and international. diplomacy. John Prados, I can't remember when I met him for the first time. He just always seemed to be there at conventions and other meetings where we met and talked. And John, of course, always had the ability to correct anything that I might have done wrong. He would hold that one finger up and say, yes, but you can do this, but you have to think about these other things. And that man has it completely wrong. One other incident I want to mention particularly, one time at a Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations luncheon, the guest speaker was General David Petraeus, and John and I were sitting at the same table. And he had an intermediary who was taking the questions from the audience and giving Petraeus the softball questions. And this really irritated John and his sense of the proper way in which this should be done. And after a few private snorts, he actually got up and left the table. It's the first time I've ever seen him do that. But he felt really very much that David Petraeus was being let off all too easily at that moment. And I could also say that through the years I knew him, I never once doubted John Prados's friendship, his ability to be sort of a representative for all of us in terms of go-between between historians and policymakers, who was respected on all sides. And so I am so really very happy to have participated in this. And Lord, I miss him every day. I may think about John, what he was said about something that was happening abroad or at home. So thank you very much for asking me to participate in this. And I'll say goodbye now and let other people have a chance.
Now I'd like to introduce John's beloved daughters, Danny and Tasha. And I think we had Danny now in Granite Falls, Minnesota. No, you smashed. Tasha, come first.
Hi.
A digital nomad
Yes.
who is also, I was just reading her in National Geographic. I'm very proud to have her.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tasha, John's younger daughter. Thank you so much to Tom and the Archive for hosting this and for giving my dad's scholarship a home for decades. Being a fellow at the National Security Archive was much more than a job to him. It was his contribution to history. How to describe Dad? He was smart. He loved history and books. Obviously, he chose the right career as an author, a historian, and a game maker. He had a thirst for knowledge, and for many years, I think his catchphrase was, "Look it up." I probably owe my critical thinking skills, power of analysis, and love of research to him. OkCupid once said I was in the top percentile for vaginal thinkers. I'm pretty sure I can thank Dad for that. My dad loved routines and traditions. It's because of Dad that I have treasured memories of Thanksgiving and Christmas. Whereas my mother was not at all into it, her idea of a Christmas stocking was one orange and one bar of chocolate, Dad really knew how to do holidays. There's no better taste than his Thanksgiving stuffing. Every Christmas we'd have a beautiful tree and make story cookies. We'd take turns placing a cookie cutter and with it a piece of a story. We called them story cookies. Oh, I just said that. Dad was so creative. When we were kids, he turned an entire room of our house into Castle Land in the winter. A land of Legos, of the good castle and the dark castle, Sauron and Robin Hood, dragons and princesses. Every day I would rush home to see if the castle genie had granted us a new crocodile, hand-painted river on a poster board complete with salt, or a new character. Dad loved science fiction and fantasy. He introduced us to Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, Star Wars, all the good stuff. He gave me a love of board games and taught me to play Risk. More often than not, I would beat his slow and steady strategy with my kamikaze risk-taking tactics, not unlike our personalities. Every year, he joked he was turning 16. He would have chocolate whipped cream cake with strawberries, and he would pick a day to take the whole day to just read, just like he would choose one single football game to watch every year. Dad never gave up his secrets. To this day, he would send me Christmas presents from Santa, Rudolph, or a secret admirer. I'll never know how he got away with being the tooth fairy. I set traps for him. Literally, I would wrap my tooth in a paper towel, tie it in a plastic bag, tie a string around it, and tie it to my finger and put it under my pillow. He would still get it. I guess I was a sound sleeper. He was a private guy and he hated technology. I gave him my MacBook and iPhone and he refused to use them for years because they could track his location. He still didn't have a cell phone. We got into endless fights about why he refused to video chat me for free instead calling me from his landline while I was abroad. Getting him to Zoom with me remains one of the greatest accomplishments in my life. Before my dad died, I asked him what he was most proud of. So I'll leave you with his words. He said, "Raising two wonderful daughters, my stance against the Vietnam War, my work on government openness and accessibility, the history that I've captured, and that I made it to my age without going broke." Thank you for being here today. Dad would have loved this. What a tradition. They throw a great party for you on the one day they know you can't make it. That's from The Big Chill, a movie my dad loved. Thank you for coming to celebrate my dad, something I wish I'd done more of when he was alive. We had a complicated relationship, especially after my parents' divorce. I will miss him dearly. I loved hearing the stories and memories everyone is sharing of John. It's amazing to know someone for 34 years and find out there's still so much more about them you didn't know. Please keep sharing. Love you, Dad.
Hello everyone, I'm the one from Granite Falls, which is a place in the wilds of rural Minnesota. I still don't know how I ended up there. I'm sure my father arranged it in some Machiavellian orchestrated role that is currently putting me much closer to his career path than I ever planned. A huge thank you to Tom and everyone here at the Archives. Tom said this was his home away from home, and that is absolutely true. I think you were also the rest of his family. We were talking a little bit about how he liked to compartmentalize. And so it's really great to get to meet the rest of the family. I hope we continue. That compartmentalization wasn't actually that accurate. The multitasking Lenny referred to, he was amazing at balancing all these different things. But a lot of his joys and his passions and his work leaked over into his supposedly sequestered personal life. Tasha referenced Castleland, which was this multi-year, like only in the winter, when winter is coming. It started as a logistical problem-solving parental technique. We had this back room that was mostly windows with a glass back door, at what we used all of the year to get outside. And in the winter, for economic purposes, he had to seal it up for heat. And we were so angry he had to come up with a really good excuse for us to not use the back door. So he invented, on the spot, this massive game because he had this plastic hexagonal land map that he couldn't utilize for another game. So he put it out, and he found, he really loved Legos, and he found this one Lego castle kit. And he gave it to us for Christmas, even though it was really for him. And all of a sudden we had a game with a castle. And we started playing it, and we made up the rules as we went along, which was his favorite thing to do. He loved making up his own rules. And it allowed him to inhabit this role of castle genie, so, you know, the magic maker behind the scenes who got to change the rules with no notice. And so instead of being so angry when he sealed up the door for the winter, it became this, winter is coming, Castleland is back, and we don't know to this day where he hid all this stuff, but boxes and boxes would get unearthed, and we started incorporating every single literary character that we had read into this game. And so what had started as a problem-solving technique and then became this creative way to get the kids to not whine all winter became this enormously complex, ever-evolving family structure and game, and taught us to think and to totally get rid of the divides between genres. The compartmentalization utterly failed. I mean, Robin Hood and Gandalf were fighting Sauron. There was a Star Wars contingent. All of a sudden, you know, Captain Nemo surfaced. It was just insane. And I think that was, even though I think he maintained in his head these boundaries for the sake of organization, everything that he loved bled into everything else that he loved. I can absolutely corroborate the deep commitment to the joy of dancing. We had family dance parties that actually blocked fire exits. We would push all of the furniture against every possible way to get out of the house to make enough room to dance. He loved cooking, and he was methodical about it, the same way he was methodical about his games. He gave me a decision when I think I was 4. And he always committed to making a well-rounded dinner for the family, which required at least an hour of preparation ahead of time. And so I knew he would be in the kitchen for an hour before dinner, so if I wanted time with him, that's where I could track him. And at some point I asked, oh, can you teach me how to cook? And he contemplates, this little 4-year-old girl. He says, I'll give you 2 options. 1, you can come in and out as you go, and I'll kind of tell you some things now and then, and that can be fun. Or 2, you can commit to learn how to cook. And that means you are in here every day for at least an hour, and for the first few months, you don't get to touch anything. You get to watch and listen and learn, and then if I can trust you, then maybe I'll let you salt the boiling water. And this went on for several years, and as a result, I can cook, which is amazing. And he was the same about learning games. We had this dining room in our house that was only used as a dining room, I think, for Thanksgiving. The rest of the time, one side of it had all of his newspaper clippings behind it, and had a little workstation at the end of the table for all of his research, which was in addition to his office upstairs. And the rest of it was the game space. And every Saturday, him and his amazing friends would come and test games together. They would start with coffee, they'd progress to beer, and when we were little and we were very, very lucky, we were allowed to roll dice. And then if we could be trusted to do that, eventually someone would whisper their strategy and why they needed a 3. And over the course of years, we learned gaming. And it was the same with books. So he also hated when we called him Dad. He much preferred Gato or Papa Gato, because everything was his way. And there was also some spy training when we were little. There was a lot of disappointment, I think, in later careers. And so now that I'm coming back and using, ironically, mostly there's been a confluence of events since he's passed, and all of a sudden I find myself creating these citywide games to build civic infrastructure, and I really wish I could talk to him about it. But all of these seeds that he planted, and I know that it wasn't just for us, but in every relationship, planting these seeds of joy and joie de vivre and all these stories of storytelling and food and wine and games and bringing people together and connecting. And so I know that he studied the past to mine it for information for the future. So I hope we can all take those seeds into the future for his legacy. Thanks so much for having me.
Now we're going to go to John's longtime friend and publisher, Ivan D.
John was first of all, a meticulous scholar, and his attention to detail was phenomenal. In the books that we published together, there were chapters which I'm sure were 7 or 8 pages too long, because John insisted on getting the details of particular incidents or trends, and I couldn't talk him out of it. But when he was not at work, he was a gentle soul with a very nice sense of humor. And we shared many meals together, which included long chats, long conversations. And he had a nice sense of humor, and one of his secret sharings, I think, was baseball. We talked a fair amount of baseball when we were together. And he once sent me, in fact, a small replica of Wrigley Field, which I still keep on a desk here, as a token of esteem. He couldn't have picked a better one. And I should say that I thought John was brought out to his best by Ellen, who was a great companion for him, and we enjoyed many evenings with both of them. We wish her well, and we have fond memories of John, which we will keep.
Now I'd like to ask Tim Weiner to come up. Great friend of John's, Pulitzer winner, Times sleuth on CIA, FBI, and I should say, one of the great unindicted co-conspirators of the archive. Timothy, please.
So the universe of radical hippie freaks who are really, really into nuclear weapons is not large.
They're all here.
Among the number of radical hippie freaks who are really into nuclear weapons and who actually understand the intricacies of how Washington and Moscow built tens of thousands of nuclear warheads when a couple of hundred would have destroyed the planet 10 times over, and who then take the trouble to understand how the United States, through its intelligence agencies, spent uncounted billions of dollars, because the budgets were classified, to build a constellation of spy satellites, look down on the old Soviet Union in the 80s, and estimated that the Soviets were 10 feet tall when they were 5'8", because we were counting the wrong things. We were counting the missiles in their silos, and we weren't looking at the potatoes rotting in the fields because there was no fuel to take in the market. So that's now a fairly small subset of radical hippie freaks who understand. Then, among those people, the number of people who really understand how the Central Intelligence Agency works. Because, like a hungry dog searching for a buried bone, they have spent years, yea, decades, digging out the documents that really tell you what really happened and not the official version. what you're supposed to think happened, and who understand the agency so well that they are capable of writing a penetrating, sympathetic, and extraordinarily detailed biography of one of the directors of Central Intelligence, William Colby, in describing the spiritual crisis that this man went through. Well, that's really getting down to a handful of people right now. And then the number of people among that vanishingly small number who could, for years on end, dig up, sift, analyze, understand the folly of power and the cost that folly inflicts on otherwise decent human beings. Well, you're really getting down to John right now. I mean, that's the universe of one guy. Maybe one or two, but among the one or two, the number of people who can do all that and still retain a kind of childlike sense of wonder and the gift of laughter and the sense that the world is mad, but you better try to understand the madness to keep yourself sane. Well, that's John. And I have never seen a happier human being, I don't think in my entire life, than when Kate Doyle, his colleague and mine, 30 years standing, we're sitting with John at V&T's Pizza on 110th and Amsterdam. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So we were sitting in a booth, Kate was here, I was here, and John was over here. And John ordered a couple of minor appetizers and the world's largest sausage and pepper pizza, like, 18 inches across, and started slowly demolishing this pizza, piece by piece, bite by bite. His smile getting wider and wider as he recounted his various adventures at Columbia, where he had arrived in 1969, regretting all his life that he wasn't there for the SDS uprising a year later, and lamenting that during his years at Columbia, it had gone from a kind of a Woodstock nation of scholars to a place where these dweebs were running around with briefcases and $400 Texas Instrument calculators that could do like long division, and lamenting the lost paradise of radical America. Well, by the time he got to the 6th or 7th pizza, he wasn't being nostalgic anymore. He was just in a state of grace. And that is how I will remember.
A state of grace. I love that. On the videotape, we have Fred Lodeval, another Pulitzer Prize winner for his work on Vietnam and Kennedy, remembering John.
My name is Fred Logeval, and I want to say to begin with that I'm just so sorry that I can't be with all of you for this really special occasion to honor John, one of our great historians, and also just a wonderful human being. But at least I can be here virtually and say something from afar. I'm in my native Sweden at the moment. I'm in Uppsala, and at least I get a chance to do this. And I want to, I guess, indicate that John meant a great deal to me as a young historian. When I'm starting out and I encountered John for the first time at an academic conference, as one often encountered John. He was a mainstay at a number of annual meetings, as you know. I'll never forget that first meeting because he cut an intimidating figure. And especially, again, for somebody who's just starting out, to be on a panel with John Prados, my goodness, you quickly learned you had to have your act together. You needed to know where your sources were from. You needed to be able to back up all the arguments that you're making in your presentation. And that taught me a lot. And I think the second time I was on a panel with John, I therefore knew, okay, I've got to be prepared for any and all interventions and be able to really defend what I'm arguing. And that's just hugely important. And I've tried to teach my own students to do the same thing and to approach, therefore, their academic presentations in that way. And yet he was also not, he wasn't ideological in the sense that what he cared about were the sources. If you could present an argument, even one that he disagreed with, but you could back it up, if not with hard evidence, then at least with, inference and with circumstantial evidence, then that was okay. And so he just meant so much to me as a scholar. I loved seeing him at conferences. I realized that underneath the sort of somewhat forbidding exterior was a teddy bear, a warm-hearted guy with a wonderful laugh. I think you all know what I mean. His laugh is just, it's just something that I treasured. And so best of luck to all of you, of course, and on this occasion when you're all together, enjoy each other and your memory of this extraordinary man. And thanks for giving me the floor for a minute or two. Take care.
Now I'm going to call on Ellen, who asked me to say about her that she left her birth country, otherwise known as Boston, to come to Washington to live with John in the year 2000, and it was a, and I'm quoting, mixed union. John was Pepsi, Ellen was Coke. John was Yankees, Ellen was Red Sox Nation. I think I'll let Ellen take it from there. Ellen Pinson.
All of that's true. I had to write this because I was afraid I couldn't just speak from my heart, so I have to read what I'm going to say. For most people, Paris is the city of love. John and I had a different take on that. We considered Lubbock, Texas, our city of love. You laugh. That's where we met on April 18th, 1996, at a very unromantic conference about the Vietnam War. John was one of the major speakers. Surprise! His talk was about the CIA analysis of the Vietnam War. I was the commentator on a panel about reassessing patterns of remembrance in Vietnam War memorials. In other words, I got to describe the wall. We met the night before the conference actually began, when John walked over to the table where I was sitting with some friends, after I gave them Boston Marathon 100th anniversary t-shirts. John wanted to know where his was. As I had no idea who he was, I asked his name and why I would have brought him the t-shirt. He said his name, and I realized that I had read his book, The Value of Decision, Case On, and had listed it in my bibliography for my master's thesis. But I didn't know who he was. So I did find one some years later through a friend from Hopkinton, Massachusetts. But the next day was the plenary session, and John was one of the main speakers. He began by discussing the date and its importance in American history. April 19th, Patriots' Day. Of course, well known to us New Englanders. John talked about David Koresh and Timothy McVeigh, who warped the meaning of Patriots' Day. But then John veered off and began talking about leading the charge up Bunker Hill. I yelled out, which you do not do at conferences. You politely wait and let the speaker make a fool of himself and then correct him afterwards when no one else can hear. But I yelled out, "No, no, you mean the Battle of Lexington and Concord. That's Patriots Day, not Concord." The whole place turned to stare at me, and very few realized that I was right. This was a conference of military and intelligence agents who were not well versed in the American Revolution history of New England. However, John realized that I was right. So I immediately apologized and threw my hands up in the air and said, "Well, I'm a Bostonian." And fortunately, most people in the audience laughed, or I would have been banished forever. Anyway, I chased him around after that. I bought a second copy of the book I already owned and pleaded with him to inscribe it for me, and I still have it. I'm not going to claim that we fell in love that weekend, but we did bond over the realization that we both put sugar in our coffee cups before we put the coffee in, because we felt that it dissipated the sugar throughout the coffee much better. Anyway, this is dedicated to the one I love, Prince Gatto, always and in all ways. We called our life together the grand adventure. We committed to love for eternity. We were ageless and timeless. John helped me see the music and feel the colors. We were not done with love, even at our ages, especially not at our age. E. E. Cummings wrote, "I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I am never without it." John's eyes sparkled when I walked into his field of vision, even if I had just left the room for a moment to get a second cup of coffee. I will miss all the things that we never got to discuss. John loved panda fruitsicles and always wanted to taste one. He had a delightful time counting the number of sneezes I expelled when I would have a sneezing fit. He laughed at Spy versus Spy, Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Minions, and his favorite, Wile E. Coyote, Certified Genius. He loved sunrises and sunbathing, Thanksgiving and making the stuffing, Christmas and handing out the presents as one of Santa's larger elves. He loved his birthday. He'd make his favorite chocolate whipped cream cake and stay in bed to read books all day. And he was most proud of his affiliation with Vietnam veterans against the war. William Goldman, the screenwriter of All the President's Men, Butch Cassidy, and A Bridge Too Far, said of Hollywood, "Nobody knows anything." Well, William Goldman didn't know John, who knew lots of things and shared that knowledge with just about everyone who asked or needed to know. He hated speed cameras, misidentification of military equipment in movies or documentaries, and reenactors. He wouldn't request his FOIA file. This man was an expert in FOIA, but he wouldn't request his FOIA file because he did not want to know who the informants were among the members of Vietnam veterans against the war. He didn't ever want to know because he didn't ever want to hate that person. It especially annoyed him that he had to share his birthday with Tricky. John would hate the war in Ukraine continues, but he would love those new CBD commercials that have begun to appear on television. His memory is a blessing. To live in the hearts you leave behind is not to die. He rests for eternity among the stars.
it's an honor now to turn to David Connolly for last words. And you have the words, we love them so much, and put them on the back of the program. And very proud to have you here. Proud lifetime Vietnam Veterans Against the War. David.
I've known Ellie for probably just about 50 years, and I was talking to you with old friends, and one of them described you, and I may pronounce this wrong, being 96% Irish and 4% Viking. But, he called you a Sherrick Friend, a steadfast woman, which is so appropriate. Forgot though. You left too soon with far too much left unsaid. And how is it that I'm still here talking and I'm told you are now dead? Now taught me my friends would go sometimes in the roar of a rocket with a shot in the blink of an eye. And now all I've got is memories of you and left to wonder why. And outside the politics, you and I always spoke of, and the ladies we love, of our kids, the things in which our lives are really made of. But we have more left between us, and when my time does come, we'll sit and grin and praise Jah and drink Pepsi and Puerto Rican rum.
And with that, I'd like to invite you all to come up to the 7th floor, to grin, to praise Jah and John, and there's even Puerto Rican rum. Please join us. Thank you all for being here today. Please come up.